As we begin another sermon in our stewardship series, I want to make something very clear to you. I want you to understand the motivation behind this series. I want you to understand why we take this time in November to talk about our finances. And what I want you to hear is that we don't want something from you. We want something for you. And I totally understand when a church starts to talk about money, a lot of things can go on in our mind. We might have flashbacks of someone who was manipulative in the past. We might start to come to conclusions like, I knew it, all they want is my money. And so I want you to hear, we don't want something from you. We want something for you. And what we want for you is to have a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. That is our mission here at Calvary. If you hear nothing else today, if you decide to take a nap, if you're like stressing out about the Vikings game tonight, if you're planning what you're going to order for brunch, whatever it is, if you hear nothing else, I want you to hear what we want for you this morning is a relationship with Jesus Christ. And the amazing thing about this relationship is it comes no strings attached. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to convince God to love you. There's no dollar amount attached to this. It's a free gift of grace that's available for every single one of us here. And we talk about a growing relationship with Jesus because it's dynamic, it's alive. Every single day, we believe every one of us here can take another step of faith. You don't ever graduate until one day we go be with God forever. And so that's our heart, that's our desire. We want every person here to have a growing relationship with Jesus. He wants to forgive you. He wants to renew you. He wants to change your life. And he wants to give you hope for the future. And so again, whether or not you listen to another word I say, whether you apply anything I say, just know that Jesus loves you so much that he sacrificed his life so that you could have new life and you could have hope in him. Now, because God loves us that much, because he will stop at nothing to pursue us and to bring us back into relationship with him, we believe he cares about every single aspect of our life. He cares about every decision we make. He cares about everything on our calendar, every moment of the day, and that includes our money and our finances. And God knows that in our lives, one of the biggest obstacles in our relationships with others and in our relationship with him can be how we handle our money and our finances. And because he knows that to be true, he wants to speak into that, and he wants to walk with us, and he wants to be a part of how we approach all that he's blessed us with. You see, God wants us to learn how to be good at being rich. He wants us to learn how to be good with everything that he's blessed us with. Now, last week, if you were here, we talked about how many of us never think about how rich we are. Because when we drive around town or we're going somewhere, we can see all these other people who seem to have it so much better than us. It might even be our next door neighbors. You know, they've got the newest this or the brand new car or whatever else. And it makes us feel like we are far from rich. But we have to remember how incredibly blessed we are by God. Just living in this country, we have so much more than a majority of the world. But because we don't feel rich a lot of times, we don't stop to think about it and to think about how to be good at it. And I was thinking back throughout my life at maybe some of the times I've felt rich. And of course, they're few and far between. I mean, I think it's how we tend to operate. But I remember back when I was 17 years old and I really felt rich because I was certified to be a lifeguard and then to teach swimming lessons, and it was the greatest job in the world and it paid really well. My favorite thing to do was to teach infant parent swimming lessons because all I would do is go through the crowd and I would hold every baby for like 30 seconds and then hand it back to their parent, and there was like no expectation that this little baby's gonna do the butterfly or jump off the diving board. It was like the easiest thing ever. It was awesome. But eventually I got into teaching private swimming lessons when I found out how well that paid. I got $15 a half hour, which was amazing for a 17-year-old 20 years ago or more. And the thing you need to know about me, and my wife can confirm this, is I don't really like to spend money much, all right? I'm a pretty good saver. Maybe you'd even say kind of stingy at times, or she would certainly say. And so I started to put all my checks in the bank. And I thought about all the things I would love to buy, but I didn't buy anything. And so that account continued to grow and grow and grow, and I thought about all the things I could still buy, but I didn't buy anything. And suddenly, I felt rich. And I learned a really important lesson about being rich, and that's this. If you want to feel rich, get a job and then move in with your parents. Now, again, by virtually any standard, any metric we use, in relation to the rest of the world, we are incredibly rich and blessed. As I said last week, if you make between $40,000 and $50,000 a year in household income, you are in the top 1% of wage earners over the entire world. But again, so often we don't feel it. We don't really even believe it. We push back against statistics like that because, again, we can see so many people around us who have so much more than we do. Now, the problem is, as we get more and more, as God blesses us more and more, we tend to let our hope migrate. We take our hope and our trust from God, and we start to put it in our stuff. And what happens is we close our hands tightly around what we accumulate. We start to cling onto it for life, and we start to think, this is where I'm going to find fulfillment, and this is where I'm going to find security, and if I can just get enough, I'm going to be self-sufficient, and I'm going to be bulletproof. Nothing can touch me. Last week, we talked about how King Solomon, the richest person in the world, wrote the book of Proverbs. And he said, what we tend to do is to try to build a fortress around ourselves. We try to build walls that can protect us from everything this world could throw at us. And we try to build them around our family and our friends and the people that we hold dear to ourselves. But what Solomon says is that walls are never high enough. We can never totally be self-sufficient. It's just an illusion. And meanwhile, when we hold on tightly to what we have, it causes us to be miserable. It causes us to be less and less generous. Now, the Apostle Paul understood this well. And so he wrote a letter to Timothy, who is one of his proteges. And Timothy was leading some churches, and Paul is giving him some advice. He's trying to help him minister to his churches. So in 1 Timothy 6, starting in verse 17, Paul says, command those who are rich in this present world. Time out for a moment. We have to understand that this applies to us. Before you push back, before you start to say, oh yeah, give it to those rich people, understand we are rich in this present world. So he says, command all of us not to be arrogant, or to put our hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put our hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Don't put your hope and your trust in something temporary and uncertain like your wealth. Make sure that your hope is centered in God, who is the giver of all things. Now, some point in your life, at the end of your life, your hope is going to shift to God. And we don't know when this is going to happen. It might be a diagnosis that we get at the doctor. It might be one of those tragic phone calls that we hope we never get. Or it might just be at the end of a long, great life. But one day, when we come face to face with our mortality, our hope will shift. It will go right back to God, where all certainty and all our promises are. But in the meantime, what would happen if we wouldn't allow our hope to migrate? What if we wouldn't buy into the illusion of this world that we can somehow accumulate our way to self-sufficiency? What if we would place all of our hope and all of our trust in God. And so last week we talked about making a commitment and saying, maybe daily, I will not put my hope in riches, but in him who richly provides. When we're logging onto our bank accounts and we start to see where things are at and we start to think, well, maybe if I just had a little bit more, then we return to this phrase. We say, I will not put my hope in riches, but in him who richly provides. Our neighbor gets a brand new car, gets a promotion at work, and we start to feel jealous and we start to feel inadequate. We remember, I will not put my hope in riches, but in him who richly provides. But the question is, what can we do? What are some steps that we can take to make sure that our hope doesn't migrate? Well, Paul goes on in verse 18 to explain what we should do. He says, command them to do good and to be rich in good deeds. Do good and be rich in good deeds. You see, blessed people like all of us, have a greater responsibility to make an impact in other people's lives. The more money and the more time you are blessed with, the more opportunities you have to impact others. But there's always this temptation, the more money we have, the more time we have, to just use it for ourselves and what we want to do. And so Paul is saying, command us to do good and to be full of good works. Don't just be tempted to help yourself out. Make sure that you're helping others. Now, have you ever stopped to think of how amazing it is that most of us only have to work 5 days a week in order to survive for 7? That is not true in a majority of the world. Most places in the world, you need to work 7 days in order to live 7 days. But here in America, we often only need to work 5 days a week, and we still have enough food to eat, and we still have a place to stay. Now, also think about how amazing it is that in most of our households, we only need 1 or 2 people working in order for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people to live for 7 days. Again, this is unheard of in a majority of the world. It takes almost everyone in a household to work and survive in many places in the world. Again, we are so greatly blessed. Now, if you work 60 hours a week and you sleep 8 hours a night, did you know you have 52 hours to do with whatever you want? 52 hours to do whatever you want with. Again, this is unheard of in a majority of the world. What are you going to choose to use those 52 hours for? I think we have a responsibility to do more good for more people, not just ourselves. We need to be asking, how are we going to bless others with what we have been blessed with? Well, Paul goes on then, and he says, be generous and willing to share. Be generous and willing to share. Now, why do you think Paul would have to spell that out so clearly? Well, it's because the opposite is so often true. The more we have, the less generous we tend to be. Now, rich people often give large sums of money away, but it's oftentimes smaller percentages of their income. I remember back to the first church I served out of seminary, and we were going through some controversial changes at the church. And one day, my senior pastor called me in, and he was trying to teach me, kind of the ins and outs of being a pastor, and he said, check out this email I got. So I read through this email, and it was from our biggest giver at the church. And he said, I gave $500,000 to the first building project, and I gave $250,000 to the next giving appeal. And he went through this whole list of all that he had given. And he said, because I have given this much, I should get to decide on these changes. And I thought, wow, pretty good point, I guess. And my senior pastor said, well, look at my response. And he had replied to the email, and he said, we are so thankful for all that you've given, and we are thankful for your generosity. But he said, there are many people here at the church, who have sacrificed a lot more and have given proportionally much more than you have. And it was a hard email, but it was so, so true. And this leads into a key, really the key for this morning. And if you let this truth shift from your head to your heart, I believe it could transform your life. And it could transform our church community, and it could transform the world. Now, when you hear it, you might have some initial defensiveness. You might want to push back. But I believe if you embrace this truth from the Gospels, it will bring you freedom, like maybe you've never experienced. Now, I learned this concept from Pastor Andy Stanley. He wrote a great little stewardship book called How to Be Rich. According to Jesus in the Gospels, generosity is not about the number of dollars given. It's about the percentage that is given. We see again and again throughout Scripture, God is not impressed by the dollar amount or the number of zeros. Instead, what Jesus clearly teaches us, that God is impressed and God is moved by percentage. And one of the places we see this is when Jesus is with his disciples in the temple in Mark chapter 12. And it says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Now, you need to understand, at this time in the church, they didn't take an offering like we do. They didn't pass plates or buckets or whatever down the row. They had a huge box right up in front. And at whatever time you felt led, you could come forward and you wanted to be seen by as many people as possible, and you could put your offering into the treasury box. And so Jesus is sitting there. He's watching this take place. And it says, many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Now, maybe you've heard this story told before called the widow's mite, because the unit of currency she's using was a mite, and it was almost too small to be measured. It was basically worth 1/128th of a daily wage, which meant this was equivalent to 6 minutes of work. So she puts this in the treasury. Calling all the disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Jesus is telling his disciples, this widow is more generous than everyone else. And it blew their minds. They're thinking, well, we saw Fred. He owns the Chevrolet dealership in town. How is she more generous than him? And then they're thinking, but Susan came up and she's the CEO of the huge pharmaceutical company. How is this woman who just put a couple coins in more generous than them? And you know what God is saying to us, what he's teaching us, is that zeros don't move me. Percentages move me. Now, I think oftentimes we only stop to think about percentages maybe once a year. Income tax season, right? I mean, we're all pretty clear what percentage we end up paying on our taxes. But in other aspects of our life, we don't always stop to be that careful. Now, I always tell pre-marriage couples I meet with, one of the most valuable things they can spend their time on before they get married is putting a budget together. And in the process, deciding what percentage are we going to live on? What percentage of our income are we going to live on? Are we going to commit to? Because if you start out living on 100%, it quickly becomes 105% and 125%. And it's why so many people in our country and in our world struggle with debt today. Now, the fact is, Americans tend to be spontaneous and emotional givers. Little girl comes to the door selling cookies, and we're all in. We see images on TV of a foreign country, and we're spurred to give. We see maybe a face up on the screen, and we're ready to throw some money in the plate. But we don't always stop to calculate the percentage. I mean, just the act of giving makes us feel generous. But God says, that's not generous. You're just giving your leftovers. Remember, Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is. Now imagine if we stopped right now and had everybody bring their income tax return forward. Don't worry, we're not going to do it. But just imagine if we did. If we all had to share the percentage of what we've given. How about if we had to bring our checkbooks? If we had to bring our financial returns from our bank? What would we conclude about each other and where our heart is? I mean, if we looked at our income tax returns, if we looked at our checkbook, what would it say about where we're putting our hope and our trust? What would it say about the number one priority in our life? The surefire way to ensure that your hope doesn't migrate towards your money and your stuff is to do something very simple, but often very difficult. Have a plan. Know where your money is going ahead of time. You see, what this is it's managing your money instead of letting your money manage you. Manage your money, or your money will end up managing you. And so I want to share 3 words that I think if you put these into practice in the right order, it can revolutionize your life and it can create margin and allow you to be a much more generous person. Memorize these words, put them into practice. They are give, then save, then live. That's God's plan for financial management. It's God's plan for finding peace with our finances. If you want to be good at being blessed, if you want to have more margin in your life, if you want to be ready for the good times and the bad times that will always come, give first, then save, then live on the rest. The first 10% is God's because the whole 100% is God's. Everything we have is a gift from Him. But He asks us for the first 10%, then save 10% and live on the final 80%. You see, when you get your paycheck, it's an opportunity to share your values, to make a declaration about your hope. In fact, when you get your paycheck, it's a time to speak into your money. I know that sounds weird, but you can talk to your money. And when you get your paycheck, you can say, you are not the boss of me. And just to show you that, I'm going to give some of you away. I'm going to show that you are not in control. You're not the powerful one. God is. So I'm going to show you who's boss. I'm going to give my first 10% away to God and show that He's my boss. I'm going to save 10 and I'm going to live on the rest. I'm not going to just wait for the fundraiser to come. I'm not going to wait for the mailer to come. I'm not going to wait for the kids up on the screen. I'm going to prioritize others other than myself. And I'm not just going to give my leftovers. And you know what? God has done so much for me. I'm not going to be content to just give Him a little tip like He's a waitress at a restaurant. No, I'm going to put Him first and show Him how much I value Him. Because all I have is really His. I'd like you to take a look at a video.
Thanks.
Dankeschön.
ありがとう。
Oh, I couldn't. Well, maybe just a bite.
forget the interest. Dude, he brought the pie.
So give first, then save, and then live on the rest. Most of the time, we tend to do the opposite thing, though. We live first, we maybe save a little on the side, and then we give our leftovers. God asks for a tithe, which is our first 10%. In the Old Testament, it was called the first fruits. It was the first gift of the very best. And it's a sign that we are putting our hope in Him and that the entire pie belongs to Him. You know, if I loan you $100 and then you give me $10 back, the other 90 is still mine. God gives us 100%, and He only asks for 10% back. And it's why we call it stewardship. We are just stewarding what is rightfully His. But what this also means is that we can't play games with our tithe, and we can't use it to manipulate. You know, sometimes people in a church are tempted to say something like, you know, if I don't get my way, well, then I'm not going to give my tithe. I'm going to hold that back. And you know what? That is going to damage you more spiritually than it's going to damage anyone else. God is not impressed when we play games with His money. Now, if we were to do a poll here today or go out into the community and ask people what one or two words come to mind when you hear the word money or finances, what words do you think we would commonly get? I mean, probably stress, maybe debt, maybe uncertainty, maybe unhappiness. Well, here's the thing about giving first. Giving always leads to joy. Giving always leads to joy. Now, we know this to be true. I mean, Christmas is almost here, just a few shopping days left, right? And when we give a gift to someone we love, we experience a deeper kind of joy than we ever experience when someone else gives us something, right? Giving leads to joy. Now, saving, making sure we have some money in the bank, leads to peace of mind. Now, again, don't live under the illusion that we can somehow stockpile our way to security. It's not what it's about. But it means creating margin so we can weather the storms that come up in life. When we save, it creates peace. And then when we live on the rest, that's how we find freedom. Don't spend more than you make. It's such a basic concept, yet so many people fail to put it into practice. If you live on what's left over, you will be financially free. And you'll be in a position to say, you know what, I could have the newest version of that, but I don't need to. I could have a brand new car, but I don't need to. I could go take out a bigger loan and have a bigger house, but I'm not going to. I would rather have joy, peace, and freedom than your brand new car, your bigger house, your great vacation. You know, the truth is, church, more money will never bring you joy, peace, and freedom. But managing the money God has entrusted to you will bring you joy, peace, and freedom. Give first, then save, and then live on the rest. Now imagine if you had been doing this for the past 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. As soon as you get your paycheck, you say, you're not my boss. God's my boss. I'm going to set aside some to save, and I'm going to live on the rest. Good management makes all the difference. And you know what? That goes for every aspect of our life. Will you let your Heavenly Father be your boss? Will you let Him speak into your life for every decision, for every priority, for every moment of the day? Whether it's your money or your time or your energy or the gifts you've been given, let Him be in charge. What if every single Christian got this right? Then we would truly be able to live generously. We would be able to do more good for more people. We would be able to have a greater impact in the community and beyond. We would be able to better reflect the generous love and grace that God has shown to us. You know what? We should be the most generous people on earth because we serve the most generous God. And so in closing, we have an opportunity today to make a commitment to God, to pledge to Him that in this coming year, we will put Him first. We will make Him our boss, and we will take Him at His word. We're telling Him we're not content to just give Him the leftovers. We're not content to just give Him a little bit of a tip. And so we're asking you to prayerfully consider how God is calling you to respond financially in the upcoming year. How will you respond to His amazing generosity in your life? Are you going to let Him be the boss? Are you going to fully trust in Him? Or are you going to hold back? Are you going to keep your hands closed tightly? Now remember, church, we don't give out of guilt, and we don't give out of shame, and we don't give out of obligation. No, we give in faith because of our love for Jesus. We give in faith because of our love for Jesus. It's a response. It's an act of worship because of what He has done for us. So after this next song, which is just an incredible song, I hope you reflect on every word. We're going to have the opportunity to come forward like we do every week. And you can come forward and receive communion where Jesus graciously pours out His love and grace upon us. And as you come forward to receive communion, you can put your pledge card in either of these jars up front as a commitment to God. If you didn't bring your pledge card, no problem. There's a bunch in your pews, but there's no pressure. You can also drop it on the way out. There's some jars out in the gathering area. But this is an opportunity to respond to God's amazing grace and God's amazing generosity.